At 10 minutes to 4 on Sunday morning, local time, the strongest typhoon to strike China this year came ashore on the coast of Huidong County in the city of Huizhou in Guangdong province. It arrived carrying winds of up to 162 kilometers an hour. It made landfall roughly 100 kilometers from Shenzhen, on a stretch of coastline that holds more than 100 million people and a meaningful share of the world's electronics manufacturing. China's National Meteorological Center had issued its first red typhoon warning of 2026 the previous evening, the highest level in a 4-tier system. And the confirmed death toll in Guangdong as of this recording is effectively 0. I want to be careful with that sentence because it is the most important one in this report, and it is being reported incorrectly almost everywhere. You have probably seen a headline in the last 24 hours saying Typhoon Null killed 10 people. That number is real. Those 10 people are real. They did not die in Guangdong, and they did not die because of this typhoon. In the next 20 minutes, I'll show you where that number actually came from, what genuinely happened along the Guangdong coast, how 801,000 people were moved out of the way in roughly 48 hours, why the official response tier tells you something that the headlines don't, and what this storm costs even when nobody dies. I'll also be direct about what this does not prove, because there is already a great deal of nonsense attached to it. Let's deal with the 10 first, because it matters. On Sunday, a flash flood struck a scenic area in Gansu province. Chinese state media reported at least 10 people killed and 23 injured. Gansu is in northwestern China. It is roughly 1,500 kilometers from the Guangdong coast, inland, on the edge of the lowest plateau. It is not on the typhoon's track. It is not downstream of it. The flood was triggered by a separate burst of sudden heavy rainfall. The Associated Press and ABC News reported the two events separately and clearly, with the Gansu deaths flagged as a distinct incident. But because both stories carried the words China, rain, flooding, and deaths, and because both landed on the same news cycle, a number of outlets and a great many aggregator accounts fused them into one headline. Typhoon Noul kills 10 in southern China. It is a compression error, not a conspiracy, and it happens constantly with fast-moving disaster coverage. It matters for 2 reasons. The first is straightforward accuracy. The second is that the error hides the story. If you believe Noul killed 10 people in Guangdong, the takeaway is a modest tragedy, and you move on. If you understand that the strongest typhoon of the year hit one of the densest coastlines on Earth, and the local death toll is essentially nil, then a much more interesting question opens up, which is, how? So let's walk through what actually happened, in order. Noul was the 12th named storm to affect China this season. It had already crossed the Philippines earlier in the week, where the government's disaster response agency reported at least 3 deaths and a significant number of people displaced by flooding and rain. From there, it tracked northwest across the South China Sea, passing south of Taiwan without making landfall, though Taiwan's Central Weather Administration recorded rainfall across southern and eastern parts of the island as it went by. By Saturday, it was intensifying. Hong Kong's observatory measured maximum sustained winds near the center of around 90 miles an hour as the system moved across the South China Sea toward the Guangdong coast. Saturday afternoon in Hong Kong, part of a large scaffolding structure on a high-rise building came down. Police reported it. Initial reports indicated no injuries. If you have spent any time in Hong Kong, you will know the bamboo and steel scaffolding that wraps buildings under renovation across the city, and you will understand immediately why that is the first thing to go in high wind, and why it makes such alarming footage. Over the typhoon period, Hong Kong authorities reported at least 9 people injured across the city. Saturday evening, the National Meteorological Center issued the red typhoon alert. In China's color-coded warning system, blue is the lowest, and red is the highest. This was the first red typhoon warning issued anywhere in the country in 2026. At approximately 3:50 on Sunday morning, Noul made landfall on the coast of Huidong County, Huizhou, and then it did the thing that decided the outcome. It weakened, fast, by Sunday, as it pushed inland into Guangdong. Hong Kong's observatory had it down to maximum sustained winds of around 68 miles an hour. It was downgraded from a typhoon to a tropical storm. The red alert was lowered to orange, and then to yellow, over the course of the day. Along the coast, state broadcaster CCTV reported many uprooted trees in Huilai County. Chinese weather authorities forecast continued heavy rain across southern Guangdong and southeastern Fujian. That is the physical event. A powerful storm, a direct hit on a major population center, and rapid decay after landfall. Now the part that actually explains the outcome. According to Xinhua, more than 801,000 people had been relocated for safety in Guangdong as of Sunday. 2 days earlier, the figure being reported was around 340,000. So somewhere in the region of 500,000 people were moved in the final stretch before the storm arrived, on top of those already evacuated. I want to slow down here, because that number gets read as a statistic, and it is actually a description of a machine. Moving 800,000 people is not a matter of issuing a warning and hoping. It requires identifying which villages, fishing communities, low-lying districts, and construction sites fall inside the projected impact zone. It requires somewhere for those people to go, which in practice means schools, gymnasiums, community halls, and government buildings converted into shelters. Stocked in advance. It requires transport, and it requires the transport to run before conditions make roads impassable, which means the whole operation has to finish hours before the storm arrives, rather than as it arrives. It also requires the authority to compel people to leave, which is one of the genuine structural differences between the Chinese system and most others. Evacuation orders in Guangdong are not advisory in the way they often are elsewhere. Alongside the relocations, the province shut down. High-speed rail services across Guangdong were canceled on Sunday. So were flights. The South China Morning Post reported around 1,800 flights grounded in total across the affected region. Hong Kong's airport authority said roughly 350 flights were canceled on Sunday alone, with about 2,000 passengers stranded at the airport over the weekend. Fishing fleets were called in. Drone footage released by Xinhua showed boats packed into harbor at the Shenzhen-Shanwei Special Cooperation Zone on Saturday, tied up in rows waiting it out. Here is the part that most coverage skipped, and it is the single most informative official detail available. China's National Commission for Disaster Prevention, Reduction and Relief activated a Level 4 National Disaster Relief Emergency Response for Guangdong. Level 4 is the lowest of the 4 tiers. Think about what that combination means. The country issued its highest weather warning ahead of the storm, and its lowest disaster relief response after it. That is not a contradiction, and it is not a cover-up. It is a system that took the threat seriously in advance and then, having assessed the actual damage, concluded that the province did not need the heaviest tier of national intervention. Separately, China's National Development and Reform Commission allocated 100 million yuan, roughly 14.8 million US dollars, to support recovery in Guangdong. Put those two facts side by side, and you get a fairly precise read on the scale of what happened. $15 million is a serious sum for cleanup and repair. It is not the number you allocate for flattened cities. For comparison, single typhoons that have genuinely devastated Chinese coastal provinces have produced damage figures in the billions and triggered the top tiers of the response system. So why does a storm like this hit Guangdong so hard in the first place? And why does the region take it this seriously? The geography is unforgiving. The Pearl River Delta is one of the flattest, lowest, most heavily built environments on the planet. Guangzhou, Shenzhen, Dongguan, Foshan, Zhuhai, and Hong Kong sit on or around a river mouth that opens directly onto the South China Sea. The land is alluvial, which means soft sediment deposited by the river over thousands of years, and much of the modern city area is built on reclaimed ground. That produces two distinct vulnerabilities. The first is storm surge. When a typhoon approaches, it does not just bring wind and rain. The low pressure at its center lets the sea surface rise, and the wind pushes a mound of water ahead of the storm. When that mound reaches a funnel-shaped estuary with shallow water and a narrowing shoreline, it has nowhere to spread out, so it goes up instead. Picture pushing water down a bathtub with your hand. In open water, it disperses. Against the end wall, it piles up. The Pearl River Delta is the end wall. The second is subsidence. Parts of the delta are slowly sinking, partly from the natural compaction of soft sediment, and partly from the weight of dense construction and historical groundwater extraction. A city that is sinking a few millimeters a year while the sea is rising is losing ground from both directions, and the effect is invisible right up until the day a surge arrives, and the margin turns out to be smaller than the map suggested. Add the population. The Guangdong coast supports over 100 million residents. A storm making landfall here is aimed at more people than live in most countries. Which brings us to the cost, because a storm can kill nobody and still be extremely expensive. Shenzhen and Dongguan sit at the heart of global electronics manufacturing. This is where an enormous share of the world's consumer devices, components, and assemblies are produced and shipped. When Guangdong shuts down for a day, factories stop, ports pause, container ships hold offshore, customs clearance backs up, and trucking schedules collapse. 1,800 canceled flights is not just 1,800 inconvenienced passengers. Hong Kong International Airport is one of the busiest cargo airports in the world, and a large volume of high value. Time-sensitive freight moves through it. A weekend of cancellations produces a backlog that takes days to clear and ripples into supply chains that have very little slack designed into them. The high-speed rail shutdown does the same for people and regional freight. Guangdong's rail network moves enormous daily volumes, and a full-day cancellation across a province of well over 100 million residents displaces millions of individual journeys. None of this appears in a death toll. All of it is real economic damage, and it is the form that typhoon impact increasingly takes in places with strong evacuation systems. The deaths get prevented. The disruption does not. There is one more piece of context, and I think it is the most important thing in this report. Noul was the third typhoon to make landfall in China within a single month, after Bavi and Maysak. 3 landfalling systems in roughly 30 days. That compression is the story that outlives this particular storm. Any individual typhoon is weather. A sequence is a different problem, for a reason that has nothing to do with wind speed. Emergency response capacity is finite. The same provincial teams, the same shelters, the same stockpiles of supplies, the same drainage systems, and the same repair crews handle each event in turn. When storms are spaced across a season, the system recovers between them. When they arrive in close succession, each one lands on ground that has not dried, on infrastructure that has not been fully repaired, and on response personnel who have not rested. Saturated soil is the clearest example. Rainfall that would drain harmlessly into dry ground runs straight off ground that is already full, which means the same amount of rain produces more flooding on the second storm than it did on the first, and more again on the third. Nothing about the storm has changed. The ground underneath it has. That is why the sequence matters more than the individual event, and it is also why the peak of the Western Pacific typhoon season, which runs through August, September, and into October, deserves more attention than a single landfall in late July. Now let me be honest about what this does not mean, because a certain amount of nonsense has already attached itself to this storm. Cities were not flattened. There is no reporting of leveled urban areas anywhere in Guangdong. The reported physical damage is uprooted trees, a partial scaffolding collapse in Hong Kong with no injuries, flooding, and the disruption of transport. If you see footage claiming to show a destroyed Chinese city this week, check the date and location before you believe it. Old footage from previous disasters recirculates within hours of any major storm, and it always will. Millions were not trapped. 800,000 people were relocated. And relocation is the opposite of being trapped. The figure is large because the evacuation was aggressive, and the aggressive evacuation is precisely why the death toll is what it is. A high evacuation number on a storm like this is good news being reported as though it were bad news. There is no evidence of prolonged power loss across the region. Outages during a typhoon are normal and expected. Multi-day regional blackouts would be reported, and, as of this recording, they have not been. And the claim that a storm like this is engineered, whether through weather modification, cloud seeding, or atmospheric heating, does not survive contact with the physics. A mature typhoon releases energy on a scale that dwarfs anything human technology can direct. Cloud seeding, which is genuinely practiced in China, works by encouraging moisture that already exists in a cloud to fall as precipitation. It cannot generate a cyclone, steer one, or intensify one. Null formed in the Western Pacific warm pool in July at the climatological peak of the season, and followed a track that is entirely ordinary for a storm forming where it did. So where does the honest assessment land? It sits between two errors, and both are being made right now. The first error is to inflate this, to treat a survivable storm as a catastrophe, to run the Gansu death toll under a Guangdong headline, to describe a province that is already reopening as a disaster zone. That version gets clicks, and it is wrong. And the people who live there know it is wrong. The second error is to dismiss it, to look at a low death toll and conclude that nothing happened. Something significant happened. The strongest typhoon of the year hit the most economically concentrated coastline in China. It cost a province a full day of economic activity, grounded 1,800 flights, and required moving the population of a mid-sized city out of the path of the wind. That the outcome was manageable is a result, not an absence. The correct read is that this was a serious storm, met by a system that worked, arriving as the third in a rapid sequence, at the front end of the season that historically produces the strongest storms of the year. Here is what I'll be watching, and these are the specific things that would change the assessment. The first is the Guangdong casualty and damage assessment over the coming week. Initial figures after any landfall are provisional. Deaths from flooding, landslides, and electrocution frequently surface days later, in inland areas that the storm reached after making landfall. If a meaningful Guangdong toll emerges, it will come in that window, and it will come from the rain rather than from the wind. The second is whether the relief response tier is raised above level 4. If the National Commission escalates, that is the clearest available signal that the damage assessment came back worse than the initial read. The third is the recovery allocation. The initial 100 million yuan is a first tranche. Watch whether it is supplemented, and by how much. Funding follows damage more honestly than press statements do. The fourth is the Philippines. At least 3 people died there as Null crossed earlier in the week, and displacement figures were significant. Philippine tolls after tropical systems frequently rise as reports come in from remote provinces and island municipalities, and that countries' storm reporting is consistently less prominent internationally than China's, despite often being more severe. The fifth is what forms next in the Western Pacific. 3 landfalls in a month is already an unusual cadence, and the season is not close to over. Watch the warm pool east of the Philippines and the systems developing there through August. I want to leave you with the thing that struck me most while going through this. The reason nobody in Guangdong died on Sunday morning is that at some point on Friday and Saturday, several 100,000 people were told to leave their homes, and several 100,000 people left. Buses ran. Shelters opened. Boats came in. Trains stopped. Somebody made a list of which villages sat inside the projected zone, and somebody else drove out to them. None of that is dramatic. None of it generates footage. It is the least watchable form of disaster response there is, and it is the only one that reliably works. Right now, the alert level over Guangdong is back down to yellow. The rain is still falling across the province and into Fujian. Crews are clearing trees in Hilai County, and 800,000 people are going home to find out what the water did to their houses. The storm that everyone will remember from this season has probably not formed yet. We'll be watching the same signals the forecasters are.